We're going to move on. The fallout from the SEC's probe of Goldman Sachs is starting to spread across the financial sector. According to the Financial Times, AIG is considering pursuing the Wall Street bank over losses it incurred on mortgage-backed securities. The insurance giant, which had to be bailed out by the US government, suffered a $2 billion loss from $6 billion worth of deals with Goldman's to insure CDOs. The paper says AIG has yet to decide whether to take action. Well, speaking to CNBC, highly followed banking analyst Dick Beauvais said the case has not changed his rating on Goldman's stock. Well, Dick Beauvais, very positive there. Let's find out what Chris Roebuck, visiting professor at Cass Business School, and Bruno Verstraete, CEO of Nautilus Invest, think. I think you're making the point in your notes that the bankers just don't understand the momentum which is building up against them at the moment. I mean, Goldman Sachs isn't a news story. This Abacus 2007 ACI may be a news story, but there was a lot of discomfort at the bonus story, at the Greek swap deal. There's been a lot of people looking at Goldman's for a long time, and indeed the rest of the investment banks.
Yeah, there's a number of different things going on here which I think are quite interesting. The banks think that this is a banking issue. The politicians think this is a political issue, and the public think this is a moral issue. And whilst the banks continue to deal with this as purely a banking issue and don't address the other parts of the equation, they're always going to be blindsided and they're always going to be behind the curve. And if you look at what's happened backwards from November all the way through, you know, first of all it was, you don't understand what we're doing, just go away, pat on the head, and that sort of attitude. Subsequent to that it was, things are getting a little bit difficult, let's have a little chat at Davos and see if we can in some way just calm the situation down. But that's the core issue. There are three different groups of people looking at this from completely different perspectives.
But I still contend the politicians are going to puff and wheeze, but ultimately they know that the prospect for recovery still remains built into the banks being stabilised and being allowed to recover profitability and then lending back into the economy. They may point the finger and jabber at the banks, but ultimately they will leave them alone on the regulatory front and not do anything that might hinder their ability to expand credit into the real economy. And the public will sit on the fringes and they'll just accept ultimately that that's what's going to happen.
The public, I think, will sit on the fringes to a degree, but the public respond to the messages that the politicians are sending them. So to a degree, the politicians can determine which way the debate goes. You see, the politicians have got a nice line that banking bonuses caused the problems. We know that that isn't technically correct, but it's a line that resonates with the public, and it's a lot simpler than the real answer. So the politicians use that line, so that puts the politicians in control. And your comment, I think, about what will the politicians do, if you look at what Obama's doing, that's fairly high level in terms of impact. But the interesting thing that I think summarises the bankers' attitudes is, despite the fact Obama said he was going to do it, despite the fact he said he was serious, they then tried to lobby against him. And my view is, you know, the bankers should accept when they're in a hole and stop digging.
Chris, let me ask you a question about trust. We had this crisis over the last 2 or 3 years. There's a complete breakdown in trust within financial markets, and arguably over the course of the last 12 months, trust has been partially restored. Is this whole situation that's going on with Goldman's currently and with other financial institutions a risk that trust will break down again? There's a famous Charles Kindleberger book which talks about manias, panics and crashes. He talks about the swindle. We thought the Madoff was a swindle. Are we going to see more swindles coming through? And if that happens, what happens to the trust within the financial system?
The comment of one of the previous speakers was absolutely right. It may be legal, but is it perceived as being moral or ethical? And that, I think, is the issue. Because if those that are on the receiving end of what the banks have done perceive it to have been unethical or immoral in some way, shape or form, they then start viewing those banks as second-hand car salesmen. And then you get that response. And if you look at some of the outflows from UBS and some of the other banks that had problems, then that was an indicator that the people who had investments in there lost trust in the institution.
Chris, what happened to caveat emptor? What happened to the fact that nobody made RBS or IKB get involved in Abacus 2007 ACI? Nobody made Rabobank get involved in Norma. Yeah. Mind you, the name itself, you think, would you get involved in that? But the fact remains that they knew exactly what the underlying assets were in there, regardless of who decided which assets went into these CDOs. They knew what the assets were, and they took on the investment regardless.
I think that's a fair point. You know, as you say, caveat emptor, but the issue there is, it's not so much the impact upon what the other banks think. And okay, you'll have AIG and others queuing up to have a go at Goldman's because it seems to be open season on Goldman's this week. But it's the perspective of the public, and I think what's happening is people are underestimating the degree to which the public feeds into the politicians then feed into the regulators, and that then impacts upon the market for the banks.
We've got to leave it there. Chris, very nice to see you. Hopefully you'll join us again soon. Maybe come in as a guest host. It'd be very good to see if you could. Chris Roebuck, visiting professor, Cass Business School. Bruno, you're staying with us, so we're going to expand this. I know you've got some interesting comments on Greece as well. Bruno Vestrata, the Chief Executive of Nord.